Okay, I'm doing a short recording today. We're going to read about the American Revolution on the Library of Congress. We're just going to see how far we get with 15 minutes, and then, we'll probably call it a stream. Until the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, few colonists in British North America objected to their place in the British Empire. Colonists in British America reaped many benefits from the British imperial system and bore few costs for those benefits. Indeed, until the early 1760s, the British mostly left their American colonies alone. The 7 Years' War, known in the United States as the French and Indian War, changed everything. Although Britain eventually achieved victory over France and its allies, victory had come at great cost. A staggering war debt influenced many British policies over the next decade. Attempts to raise money by reforming colonial administration, enforcing tax laws, and placing troops in America led directly to conflict with colonists. By the mid-1770s, relations between Americans and the British administration had become strained and acrimonious. Angry and bitter. The first shots of what would become the War for American Independence were fired in 1775. Sorry. Phone. I'm on my phone and I'm distracted because I'm a fucking zoomer. Okay. The first shots of what would become the War for American Independence were fired in April 1775. For some months before that clash at Lexington and Concord, patriots had been gathering arms and powder and had been training to fight the British if that became necessary. General Thomas Gage, commander of British forces around Boston, had been cautious. He did not wish to provoke the Americans. In April, however, Gage received orders to arrest several Patriot leaders rumored to be around Lexington. Gage sent his troops out on the night of April 18th, hoping to catch the colonists by surprise and thus to avoid bloodshed. When the British arrived in Lexington, however, colonial militia awaited them. A firefight soon ensued. Even so, it was not obvious that this clash would lead to war. American opinion was split. Some wanted to declare independence immediately, others hoped for a quick reconciliation. The majority of Americans remained undecided but watching and waiting. In June 1775, the Continental Congress created, on paper, a Continental Army and appointed George Washington as commander. Washington's first task when he arrived in Boston to take charge of the ragtag militia assembled there was to create an army, in fact. It was a daunting task with no ends of problems. Recruitment, retention, training and discipline, supply and payment for soldiers' services were among those problems. Nevertheless, Washington realized that keeping an army in the field was his single most important objective. During the first 2 years of the Revolutionary War, most of the fighting between the Patriots and British took place in the North. At first, the British generally had their way because of their far superior sea power. Despite Washington's daring victories at Trenton and Princeton, New Jersey, in late 1776 and early 1777, the British still retained the initiative. Indeed, had British efforts been better coordinated, they probably could have put down the rebellion in 1777, but such was not to be. Patriot forces, commanded by General Horatio Gates, achieved a significant victory at Saratoga, New York, in October 1777. Within months, this victory induced France to sign treaties of alliance and commerce with the United States. In retrospect, French involvement was the turning point of the war, although that was not obvious at the time. Between 1778 and 1781, British military operations focused on the South because the British assumed a large percentage of Southerners were loyalists who could help them subdue the Patriots. The British were successful in most conventional battles fought in that region, especially in areas close to their point of supply on the Atlantic coast. Even so, American generals Nathaniel Greene and Daniel Morgan turned to guerrilla and hit-and-run warfare that eventually stymied the British. Stymied or stymied the British? They eventually stymied the British. By 1781, British General Lord Charles Cornwallis was ordered to march into Virginia to await resupply near Chesapeake Bay. The Americans and their French allies pounced on Cornwallis and forced to surrender. Yorktown was a signal of victory for the Patriots, but two years of sporadic warfare, continued military preparations, and diplomatic negotiations still lay ahead. The Americans and British signed a preliminary peace treaty on November 30th, 1782. They signed the final treaty, known as the Peace of Paris, on September 10th, 1783. The treaty was generally quite favorable to the United States in terms of national boundaries and other concessions. Even so, British violations of the agreement would become an almost constant source of irritation between the two nations far into the future. Okay. Should I get into British reforms? What about first shots of the war? Yeah. For some months, people in the colonies had been gathering arms and powder and had been training to fight the British, if necessary, at a moment's notice. The Continental Congress had approved of preparations for defensive fighting, in case the British made an aggressive move. But General Thomas Gage, commander of British troops in Boston, had been cautious. He thought his army too small to act without reinforcements. On the other hand, his officers disdained the colonists as fighters, thinking they would flee with any show of British force. Oh. Gage received orders to arrest Sam Adams and John Hancock, rumored to be near Lexington. When Gage heard the colonists had stockpiled guns and powder in Concord, he decided to act. On the night of April 18, 1775, he dispatched nearly 1,000 troops from Boston. He hoped to catch the colonists by surprising and thus to avoid bloodshed. But all British activities were carefully watched by the Patriots, and William Dawes and Paul Revere rode out to warn people in the countryside that the British were coming. When British regulars, known as redcoats because of their uniform jackets, arrived at Lexington the next morning, they found several dozen Minutemen waiting for them on the town's common. Someone fired, no one knows who fired first, and 8 Minutemen were killed and another dozen or so were wounded. Then the British marched on Concord and destroyed what was left of the store of guns and powder, most of which had been hastily removed by the Patriots. During the Redcoats' entire march back to Boston, Minutemen harassed them, firing from behind fences, houses, trees, and rocks. By the end of the day, the Redcoats suffered 3 times more casualties than had the colonists. Whatever the truth of who fired the first shot, the Patriots were first to get their version of the event out to the American public. The effect was to rally hundreds, if not thousands, of colonists to the rebellion. When the Second Continental Congress met 3 weeks later, the meeting had been scheduled since October. It agreed to support Massachusetts in the conflict. Even so, many representatives disagreed among themselves about the purpose of the fighting. At the end of the continuum of opinion were such men as Sam and John Adams of Massachusetts and Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, who already favored independence. At the other end of that continuum were such men as John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, who hoped for a quick settlement and reconciliation with Great Britain. Most delegates, like most colonists, were moderates with opinions somewhere in the middle of that continuum. Over the next year of conflict, bungling British policymakers tried to recruit Indians, slaves, and foreign mercenaries. They blockaded colonial ports, and they rejected Aylesford's all efforts, all efforts, all efforts, all efforts. They rejected all efforts at conciliation. These actions pushed more and more colonists to favor independence. Damn. And then maybe one more, and then maybe one more. Pershot, turning points in the vase, groping towards peace. And then creating the Continental Army. Why not? According to Washington's aide, Alexander Hamilton, the military strategy that the general would pursue throughout the Revolutionary Era was as follows. Our hopes are not placed in any particular city or spot of ground, but in preserving a good army, to take advantage of favorable opportunities and waste and defeat the enemy by piecemeal. Piecemeal. By unsnipe. Piecemeal. By piecemeal. In order to preserve a good army, one had to be created in the first place. Dude, I kind of want to write that word down. I'm sorry. Piecemeal. In order to preserve a good army, one had to be created in the first place. Edict designating the militia around Boston as a Continental Army and creating such an army, in fact. Although many colonials had some military experience in the French and Indian War, most had served in militia units, a far cry from service in regular European-style army. The latter, Washington believed, was what the Continental Army needed to become the colonies, The colonies were to stand up to the British Army. As Washington put the matter shortly after he arrived in Boston to make command of the army, the course of human affairs forbids an expectation that troops formed under such circumstances, militia, should at once possess the order, regularity, and discipline of veterans. Washington rather optimistically added, whatever deficiencies there may be, will, I doubt not, soon be made up by the activity and zeal of the officers and the docility and obedience of the men. These qualities, united with their native bravery and spirit, will afford a happy presage of success. How this opinion would soon change. When Washington resumed his duties in Boston, he saw no end to problems. The problems in this army, I fear, are considerable, and the new modeling of it, reorganization in the face of the enemy, from whom we every hour expect an attack, is exceedingly difficult and dangerous. Although often dismayed by his charge, Washington set out to create an army that could stand up in the field to the best army in the world at the time. Documents included here will give you a sense of some of the problems and issues. These and other problems continued to plague Washington and his army throughout the conflict. Over time, Washington would come to believe that only the creation of a permanent standing army could save the revolution. Damn, bro. Washington had no faith in his people, bro. That was a little bit on is this whole section? Well, okay, this is U.S. history. Okay, it's just like U.S. history. The new nation, national expansion and reform, Civil War and Reconstruction, rise of industrial America, progressive area to new area, Great Depression, the post-war United States. And it stops at 1968. It's getting too modern. Anyways, yeah, that was that's the American Revolution. Thanks for listening. I love you. Have a great day. There.